The cold hit her first. That was what Owen Calloway remembered most vividly when he thought back on it later. Not the silence of the church, not the pale moonlight cutting through the cracked window above the altar, not even the strange stillness of the December night pressing against the town of Harrow Creek like a hand over a mouth. It was the cold, and then it was her. He had pushed open the heavy oak door of First Grace Church at midnight on a Thursday, doing his nightly round as he always did, checking the lock, making sure no drifters had broken the latch, making sure the building was sound. Harrow Creek was a small town, but it was not a safe one. Not anymore. Not since the Farrow gang had started moving through the county 3 months ago, leaving burned homesteads and broken families in their wake. Owen had not slept more than 4 hours on any given night since September, and the circles under his eyes had deepened into something permanent, something that the townspeople had started to read as severity rather than exhaustion. He pushed the door open, and the candlelight from the single votive burning on the altar sent one long trembling shadow across the aisle. And at the end of that shadow, curled onto the back left bench with her knees drawn to her chest and her coat pulled so tightly around her that it might have been a burial shroud, was a woman. Owen Calloway stood very still. She was not dead. He could see the faint rise and fall of her breathing from where he stood. Her hair had come loose from whatever arrangement it had once been in and lay across the wood beneath her cheek, dark and tangled. One of her boots had a sole that had started to separate from the upper, and the other boot was missing entirely, her stockinged foot tucked beneath her coat for warmth. She had nothing with her. No bag, no saddlebag, no Bible, no letter, nothing that gave any indication of where she had come from or how long she intended to stay. Owen stepped closer, careful to keep his footfall quiet. He crouched down near the end of the bench and looked at her face in the candlelight, and felt something turn over slowly inside his chest, like a page in a book that had been waiting a long time to be read. She was young. 24, maybe 25, with a face that had clearly been beautiful before whatever had happened to her had happened. There was a bruise along her jaw, faded to the yellowish green of old trouble rather than new. Her lips were cracked from the cold and her eyelashes, dark and very long, were wet at the corners as though she had been crying in her sleep. She was shivering, even in sleep. The church was barely warmer than the night outside. Owen stood up. He looked around the empty building as though searching for an answer someone had left behind, then looked back at the woman. He thought about the room above his office. He thought about the wood stove he had banked before he left at 10 o'clock that evening, which would still have some heat in it. He thought about the clean quilt his mother had sent him from Missouri 2 years ago that he had never unfolded because there had never been anyone to unfold it for. He reached down and touched her shoulder very gently. She was awake in an instant. Not startled, terrified. She was on her feet and pressed against the back wall of the bench before he had even fully straightened, her eyes wide and black in the low light. Her whole body coiled as though she intended to fight or run, and had not yet decided which. Owen stepped back immediately. He raised both hands, palms out. "Easy," he said. "Easy, I am not going to hurt you." She stared at him. Her chest was heaving. She looked at the star on his coat and something in her expression shifted not toward safety but toward a more complicated, calculating kind of fear. The kind of fear that recognized authority and was not entirely sure authority was the same thing as safety. He had seen that look before. He had seen it on the faces of women who had good reason to distrust the men who wore badges. Owen kept his hands up and his voice very low and level. "My name is Owen Calloway," he said. "I am the sheriff of Harrow Creek. I was doing my rounds. I am sorry I frightened you." He paused. "You are going to freeze in here. Come home. There is a warm room ready." She did not move, she did not speak. She kept her eyes on him with an intensity that told him she was measuring every inch of the distance between them, every word he had said, every angle of his body. Owen did not push. He put his hands down slowly and took another step back, giving her the full width of the aisle. "The offer stands," he said quietly, "whenever you are ready." That was how it began. That was the moment everything changed, though neither of them could have known it then. And the story of how Eleanor Parrish came to be sleeping on a church bench in Harrow Creek on the coldest night of 1884 was not a short one. Eleanor Parrish had come west with her husband. She had been 22 years old and freshly married and full of the cautious, measured hope of a woman who had learned early that hope was something you spent carefully, or it spent you. Her husband, Thomas Parrish, had been 31, charming in the particular way of men who have learned to use charm as a tool. And Eleanor had spent the first 6 months of their marriage believing the charm was genuine, before she began to understand what lay beneath it. They had left Cincinnati in the spring of 1882 with a wagon, 2 horses, and Thomas's conviction that land in the New Mexico territory was cheap and opportunity was plentiful, and a man with enough nerve could build something that mattered. Eleanor had not argued. She had packed her mother's Bible and her good dress and her sewing kit and her small tin box of letters from her sister back in Ohio. And she had climbed up onto that wagon seat and watched Cincinnati disappear behind her, and told herself that courage was just another word for going forward even when you were afraid. Thomas had indeed found land. He had filed a claim on 80 acres outside a small settlement called Mira Flats and had built, with Eleanor's considerable help and the sporadic assistance of a neighboring family named Good, a 2-room house with a proper hearth and a kitchen garden that Eleanor coaxed into productivity with a determination that surprised even herself. For a while, things had been almost good. Then Thomas had met Marcus Farrow. Eleanor had not understood at first what Marcus Farrow was. He had presented himself as a businessman, a man with investments in several of the territory's growing towns, a man who dealt in land purchases and cattle brokering and various other commerce that sounded legitimate in the telling. He had come to their homestead with 2 of his men one afternoon in the summer of 1883, and he had sat in Eleanor's kitchen and drunk her coffee and eaten her biscuits and talked with Thomas in the easy, conspiratorial way of men who have immediately recognized in each other a shared willingness to cut corners. By November, Eleanor had pieced together enough of what she overheard to understand that Marcus Farrow was not a businessman. He was the head of an outfit that moved stolen cattle and confiscated land through intimidation, coercion, and outright violence, and Thomas had agreed to let their homestead be used as a waypoint in exchange for a cut of the profits and immunity from Farrow's attentions. That was the first betrayal. The second betrayal was Thomas's response when Eleanor confronted him. He had not shouted. He had simply looked at her with something cold and flat in his eyes, and told her that she did not understand how things worked out here, and that she would do well to keep her mouth shut and her eyes down. And then he had made it very clear, in the particular way that did not require raised hands to make its point, that there would be consequences for Eleanor if she made trouble. Eleanor had kept her mouth shut. She had kept it shut through the following months while Farrow's men came and went, while she cooked meals for people she knew had blood on their hands, while she watched Thomas grow harder and colder and more remote, while the homestead she had poured herself into became something she no longer recognized as a home. She had started making a plan in January of 1884. It was not a grand plan. It was a very small and practical plan born of necessity rather than ambition. She had begun setting aside coins from the household money, a few cents at a time, in the tin box that had once held her sister's letters. She had begun studying the road maps that Thomas kept in the drawer of his desk when he was away. She had begun paying attention to the patterns of Pharaoh's men, learning when the homestead was most empty, when the best window of time might open. In February, Thomas had found the tin box. That had ended very badly. The bruise on Alina's jaw, the one now fading to yellow-green in the candlelight of First Grace Church in Harrow Creek, was the last thing Thomas Parrish had ever given her. She had left the homestead at 3 in the morning while Thomas was sleeping off the whiskey that had preceded his anger, and she had taken the clothes on her back, and the road map she had memorized, and one of the horses, which she had lost 2 days later when the animal threw a shoe, and she could not afford to have it seen to at the farrier in the last town she had passed through. She had walked the last 40 miles. She had not known where Harrow Creek was except that it was north and north was away. She had not known there was a church until she had seen its small steeple against the winter sky and pushed through the door because she could no longer feel her feet, and she needed to stop moving for just a few hours. She had not expected anyone to find her. She had not expected the man who found her to step back and raise his hands. She had not expected him to say what he said. Owen Calloway had waited. He stood in the aisle of the church with his hands at his sides, and the cold pressing in around them both, and he waited with the particular patience of a man who understood that patience was sometimes the only thing that worked. He watched the woman across from him run her eyes over his star, his hands, his face. He watched her make calculations. He did not rush her. After what felt like a very long time, she said, "Is it far?" Her voice was low and rough from cold and disuse. It was not the voice of a woman who had been speaking much recently. Owen noted all of this with the part of his mind that was always noting things and filed it away and kept his expression calm. 2 minutes on foot, he said. My office is on the main street. There is a room above it. It locks from the inside. He added that last part deliberately because it seemed important and because he wanted her to know he had understood her calculation. She stared at him a moment longer. Then she picked up the coat she had been using as a blanket and pulled it on over the coat she was already wearing. And Owen noticed she only had 2 coats because she had nothing else. And something in his chest tightened in a way that made him want to be very careful with everything he said next. She came toward him, and he turned and walked to the door without looking back, giving her the choice of following, which was the only way he knew how to give it. He heard her footsteps behind him. He held the door open without looking at her directly, and she stepped out into the night. It was 11 degrees. The main street of Harrow Creek was empty and silver with frost, and their breath came out in clouds as they walked. Owen matched his pace to hers, which was slower than he expected, and after a moment he understood it was because her foot, the one without the boot, was wrapped in what appeared to be a piece of canvas she had tied around her ankle, and walking on frozen ground in that wrapping was causing her visible pain that she was refusing to acknowledge. He did not comment on it. He simply walked slightly slower. His office was a low building of sand-colored adobe with a wooden sign above the door that read Sheriff in faded black letters. Owen unlocked it and lit the lamp inside, and she followed him through the front room, past his desk and the rack where he kept his rifle, past the door to the single holding cell, which was empty, to the narrow staircase at the back. The room at the top was small but honest. There was a bed with a frame made of iron, a washstand, a wardrobe, a rag rug on the wooden floor, and a small iron stove in the corner that was still throwing modest heat from where Owen had banked it earlier. A window looked out over the back alley toward the dark shapes of the stable and the feed store. The quilt on the bed was folded at the foot, a Missouri quilt in blue and white that his mother had made and that had never been slept under. Owen went to the stove and added 2 pieces of wood from the small stack beside it and opened the damper. The fire caught, and the room began to feel warmer almost immediately. He turned around. The woman was standing just inside the doorway, holding her coat, closed at the throat with one fist, and looking at the room with an expression he could not immediately read. It was not suspicion exactly. It was something more like the expression of someone who had been expecting a trap and had walked in and found no trap and was not quite sure what to do with the absence of it. "There is water in the pitcher," Owen said. "I will bring food up in a moment. Nothing fancy, just what I have. Bread and salt pork, and there is some dried apple." He paused. "Is there anything you need right now?" She looked at him. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. It was a direct question, and it deserved a direct answer. Owen thought about it for a single honest second. "Because it is cold," he said. "And because it seemed like the right thing to do." She looked at him for another long moment. "Just like that," she said, not quite a question. "Just like that," he confirmed. Something moved across her face. Not trust exactly, not yet, but the very earliest edge of something that might become trust if he did not spoil it. "Eleanor," she said quietly. "My name is Eleanor Parrish." "Good night, Eleanor," Owen said. He went to the doorway and then stopped. "I will knock before I come up with the food. You can lock this door, and that lock will hold." He pointed to the bolt on the inside of the door. Then he went back down the stairs and started putting together whatever he had in the kitchen drawer. And he was careful not to think too hard about the fact that, for the first time in the 3 years, he had been living in this building. The room upstairs felt inhabited. Eleanor ate the bread, and the salt pork, and the dried apple sitting on the edge of the bed with her coat still on. She ate carefully, not greedily, which told Owen she was accustomed to eating carefully around other people. And he had left the plate and gone back downstairs without making it a moment, and she was grateful for that. She locked the door. She sat with her back against the iron headboard, and her knees drawn up, and listened to the sounds of the building settling in the cold. Below, she could hear Owen moving quietly, the scrape of a chair, the occasional sound of something being set down on a desk. Not loud, not restless, just present. She had not been in the presence of a man whose movements did not make her tense in a very long time. She held that thought carefully, turned it over, looked at its underside. She did not sleep for a long time. She lay under the Missouri quilt, which was thick and soft and smelled faintly of cedar, and she watched the small orange glow of the stove and thought about Thomas, and about Pharaoh, and about the road behind her, and the complete unknown of the road ahead. She thought about the 40 miles she had walked, and the blisters on her feet, and the cold in her hands that had not yet fully gone. She thought about the fact that she had no money, no horse, no luggage, no plan beyond the most immediate horizon. Then she thought about the sheriff's hands, raised and open in the dark church. She fell asleep somewhere after 3 in the morning. Owen slept in his chair at his desk with his coat across his lap, which was how he slept on nights when he did not feel comfortable being too far from the front door. He woke at 6:30 when the light came gray through the window, and the town began its slow morning sounds. He put on coffee and went to the stable to check on his horse, a gray gelding named Temperance, and when he came back, there was still no sound from upstairs. He let her sleep. He was writing up a report on the Harrow gang's most recent activity. A farm burned 2 counties east, a family displaced, a man badly beaten who had refused to sell his land. When he heard the creak of the stairs at 9:30. He kept his eyes on the paper and gave her the moment of coming into the room on her own terms. She came into the office doorway and stopped. She had washed her face and her hands and done her hair up in a simple knot at the back of her head. She was wearing the same dress, which was gray wool and worn but clean enough, and she had put both her coats back on. She looked at him and then around the room, taking inventory with the quick, comprehensive look of a woman who had learned to always know where the exits were. "Good morning," Owen said. "Coffee is on the stove. Cups are on the shelf above it." She went to the kitchen alcove at the back of the office, and he heard her pour a cup, and he went back to his report. After a moment she came and stood in the office doorway with the cup in both hands. "How much do you know?" she asked. Owen set his pen down. He looked at her directly. "About you specifically, only your name. About women who come through Harrow Creek at night without luggage or boots. I know the general shape of it." Her jaw tightened slightly. "I am not going to be a case for you to manage." "I did not say you were." A pause. "I need work," she said. "I can cook, I can sew, I can read and write, I can keep accounts." She said it flatly, without embarrassment but without ease either. Like a woman presenting credentials at a door she was not sure would open. Owen thought for a moment. "Agnes Holt at the hotel restaurant lost her cook 3 weeks ago. She has been managing alone and she is not managing well. I can walk you over and introduce you if you want." Eleanor looked at him. "Why would you do that?" "Because you asked for work and I know where there is some," Owen said simply. She held his eyes for a long moment. There was something assessing in it, something that was looking for the catch, looking for the hidden motive. Owen let her look. He had nothing to hide and he was not offended by the looking. "All right," she said. Agnes Holt was a woman of 55 with a pragmatic temperament and an immediate eye for competence. She looked Eleanor over, asked her 3 questions about the preparation of a proper pie crust, listened to her answers, and hired her on the spot for room and board plus $1.50 a week. Eleanor would have a room at the back of the hotel, small but private and with its own door. Owen walked back to his office alone. He sat down at his desk and stared at the report he had been writing and then stared at the wall above it for a considerable period of time. He was not a man who did things impulsively. He had been in Harrow Creek for 3 years, appointed by the county commissioners after the previous sheriff had been killed in a confrontation with a mining dispute gone badly wrong. He had come from Missouri, where he had been a deputy in a larger town, and where he had learned that most of the violence in the West was economic violence dressed up in personal grievance, and that the most useful thing a lawman could do was think clearly about causes rather than just about symptoms. He was quiet by nature. His deputies, a young man named Chet Dobbs and an older man named Ray Sutton, had both noted this in various ways. Chet called him steady. Ray called him closed off. Owen thought they were both partially right. He had not thought about anything personal in a very long time. He went back to his report. The first week, Eleanor worked every morning and afternoon in Agnes's kitchen and learned the rhythms of the hotel and the town simultaneously. Harrow Creek had perhaps 300 residents plus the ranching families who came in on weekends. There was a dry goods store run by a man named Pettigrew, a livery stable, a barber, a doctor who was also the dentist and occasionally the veterinarian when the need arose, 2 saloons, the church, the hotel, and Owen's office. Eleanor kept to herself initially with the disciplined economy of a woman who had learned that trust was a thing you extended carefully or you lost things. She did her work with a thoroughness that Agnes noticed and appreciated, and she ate her meals in the kitchen rather than the dining room, and she spent her evenings in her room with the door locked and the small oil lamp burning while she mended her things and read whatever she could find to read. The second time she saw Owen Calloway was 4 days after the church. He came into the hotel for a meal, which he did 3 or 4 times a week, and he sat at the corner table and ordered the lamb stew. And when Agnes brought it out and mentioned that her new cook had made it, he said nothing to Agnes and said nothing to Alina when she came through the dining room collecting plates. He just looked at her once with a look that was checking in without demanding anything, and she nodded very slightly to indicate that she was fine, and that was the whole of it. It was, Alina thought later back in her room, the most respectful conversation she had had in 2 years. The 3rd week, there was trouble. Owen had been tracking a rumor that Marcus Farrow himself intended to come through Harrow Creek, using it as a transit point the way he had used various other towns in the territory. Owen had been in communication with a U.S. Marshal named Harris out of Albuquerque, and Harris had confirmed that Farrow was moving east from his last known position, and that Harrow Creek was a likely stop. Owen called his 2 deputies into the office on a Tuesday morning and laid out what he knew and what he planned. Chet was 23 and eager in the way of young men who had not yet been fully introduced to consequences. Ray was 48 and methodical, and had a bad knee from an old wound that had never healed right. Between them, they covered the town adequately under normal circumstances. These were not normal circumstances. Owen told them to be alert for strangers, to keep their movements visible but not provocative, and to report anything that looked like a scouting party. He also told them to be careful and to stay alive, which he said plainly enough that they both understood it was not a rhetorical instruction. What Owen did not know was that Alina Parrish knew exactly who Marcus Farrow was. She found out Farrow was coming toward Harrow Creek on a Wednesday evening when she overheard 2 men at the far end of the hotel dining room speaking in low, careless voices about a man they called the Colonel, and a shipment moving through the county, and she recognized enough of the language to know what was being discussed. She sat very still in the kitchen doorway with a serving cloth in her hands, and listened as long as she dared, and then went back to her stove. That night she lay in her room and thought about her dark past, and about Thomas, and about the things she had seen at the homestead, and the things she had heard and whether any of it was the kind of thing that a sheriff could use. She thought about what it would mean to tell Owen Calloway what she knew. She thought about what it would mean not to tell him. She thought about the fact that Marcus Farrow knew her face. She had cooked for him. She had sat in the same room as him while he outlined plans. He was comfortable discussing in front of Thomas's wife, because Thomas's wife had, in Farrow's estimation, been sufficiently contained. She had not been sufficiently contained. She had listened to everything. In the morning, she went to Owen's office. Owen looked up when she came in, and she could see him reading her immediately. The set of her shoulders, the way she was holding her hands, the determination in her face that was clearly costing her something. He closed the folder on his desk and gave her his full attention without making a production of it. "I need to tell you something," Alina said, "and I need you to understand that what I tell you puts me at considerable risk." "Sit down," Owen said, "please." She sat in the chair across from his desk. She had not sat across from a man at a desk in a professional context since the one time she had tried to speak to a deputy in Mira Flats about Thomas's activities. And that had gone badly, because that deputy had been on Farrow's payroll. And the memory of that meeting and what had followed was one of the reasons she had ended up walking 40 miles in December. Owen watched her hands in her lap and waited. She told him. All of it. She started with Thomas and the homestead and worked through what she had seen and heard over the course of 18 months of forced proximity to Marcus Farrow's operation. She gave him names, dates as best she could recall them, locations, the rough shapes of routes and methods. She told him about the 2 men in the hotel dining room the night before, and what she had heard them say. She told him everything, and when she finished, she was trembling slightly, and she was not sure if it was fear or relief, or the residue of some enormous thing that had been held in too long. Owen had been very still through the whole of it. He had not interrupted her. He had not taken notes, which she initially found odd and then realized was because he was memorizing everything first and notes could be found by the wrong people. He had a lawman's face, controlled and quiet, but his eyes had moved over her account with an intensity that told her he was hearing every word. When she finished, he said, "Are you all right?" Elinor blinked. She had expected questions about Pharaoh. She had expected him to start asking for clarification on specific details. She had not expected that. "Yes," she said, and then, because it was the truth, "Not entirely." Owen nodded once. "What you have told me is significant," he said. "It is also the kind of information that could get you killed if the wrong people find out you have shared it. I want you to know that I understand that." He looked at her steadily. "I want you to know that I am going to take every precaution I can to make sure that does not happen." Elinor held his gaze. "You cannot promise that," she said. "No," he agreed. "But I can promise that I will not be careless with you or with what you have told me." There was a silence that was somehow different from the silences before it. "Your husband," Owen said carefully. "Does he know where you are?" "No." "Is he looking for you?" Elinor thought about Thomas and about the way he had looked at her the last time she had seen him, and about the particular kind of man who does not let go of things he considers his. "Probably," she said. Owen nodded, slow and deliberate. "I will keep that in mind." Elinor went back to work. Owen sent a wire to Marshal Harris in Albuquerque that contained enough of what Elinor had told him to make Harris sit up straight. And Harris wired back within the hour that he was sending 2 additional men and would be in Harrow Creek by Friday. Owen then spent a very careful afternoon, with his deputies going over the layout of the town, and which buildings offered the best defensive positions, and where the approach roads from the west ran in relation to the main street. In the middle of all of this, Owen found himself thinking about Elinor Parrish's hands in her lap, the way she had held them when she was telling him the hardest parts. He pushed that thought to the edge of his mind and left it there. Friday came and Marshal Harris arrived with 2 deputies who were built like the practical necessity they represented. Harris was a lean, dry-looking man of 45 with a gray mustache, and the look of someone who had been doing this particular work for long enough that nothing surprised him anymore, but a few things still bothered him. He and Owen sat in the office Friday evening after the town had quieted, and Owen laid out everything Elinor had told him, and Harris listened with the flat professional attention of a man doing arithmetic. "Your source," Harris said at the end. "How reliable?" "Completely," Owen said. Harris looked at him with the slight additional attention of a man who has heard something worth noting in a word like completely. "I would like to speak to her," Harris said. "I will ask her," Owen said. "She has already taken a significant risk. I will not require her to take more than she is willing." Harris looked at him again, this time more measuringly. "All right," he said. Elinor agreed to speak with Harris. She met him the following morning in the back room of the hotel, with Agnes Holt present as a third party because Owen had suggested it, and Elinor had found the suggestion both practical and considerate in equal measure. She answered Harris's questions with the same level precision she had brought to her account with Owen, and Harris's flat professional face shifted at several points in ways that communicated more than he probably intended. "Mrs. Parrish," he said when they had been through it, "what you have described constitutes enough evidence to issue federal warrants for Marcus Pharaoh and 6 of his associates. With your testimony, a conviction becomes substantially more probable." Alina had known this was coming. She sat with it for a moment. "My husband," she said. "Thomas Parrish, he is involved." "I know," Harris said. He said it without judgment and without softness, just the flat acknowledgement of the law. What happens to him? He will be charged. What the court decides after that depends on how much he cooperates and what the jury decides. Harris paused. "I understand that is complicated." It was complicated. Thomas had done her considerable harm. He had also put her in a position to know what she knew, and knowing what she knew had given her the only leverage she had. The fact that using that leverage required her to testify against her husband was a thing she turned around very carefully in her mind while Harris waited. "If I testify," Alina said, "what protection is offered?" "There is a boarding house in Santa Fe," Harris said. "Safe, discreet. We have used it before for witnesses, until the trial." Alina nodded slowly. She looked up and found that Owen was watching her from the doorway of the room, where he had been standing quietly through the whole exchange. He was not looking at her with the look of a man waiting for her to make a particular decision. He was looking at her with the look of a man who would support whatever she decided. That look nearly undid her, in a way she did not entirely understand and was not ready to examine. "I will testify," Alina said. Harris left for Albuquerque on Saturday to begin the warrant process, and returned on Monday with his 2 deputies, and the paperwork, and a plan that involved setting a careful and subtle trap for Harrow when he came through the county. Owen was the point of coordination for Harrow Creek's side of it, and he spent most of Monday and Tuesday in a state of efficient, quiet motion that Chet described to Ray as the sheriff being the sheriff in the direction that counts. Alina kept cooking. She made a beef and root vegetable stew on Monday, and a deep dish apple pie with a proper fluted crust on Tuesday. And Agnes said it was the best thing she had eaten since her mother died. The dining room was full, and Alina moved between the kitchen and the pass-through with the practiced economy of someone who needed to be useful, and had found a place where being useful was appreciated. On Tuesday evening, Owen came in for the stew, and after Agnes had gone back to the kitchen, Alina brought the coffee herself and sat down across from him at the corner table without being invited and without asking permission, which was a thing she noticed herself doing and found interesting. Owen looked up from his coffee. "You are working too hard," Alina said. Owen considered this. "There is a lot to be done." "There is always a lot to be done," she said. "That is not what I said." Owen looked at her for a moment with something that was nearly amusement. "All right," he said. "When does Harrow come through?" "Thursday at the earliest. Harris thinks Friday night." Alina turned her cup in her hands. "I need you to understand something," she said, and her voice had dropped to its careful, considered register. "What I told Harris about the route Harrow uses. There is a man on that route named Good, Samuel Good. He and his wife have the farm east of the one I shared with Thomas. They are not involved with Harrow. They were good people to me." She looked up. "I would like to make sure nothing happens to them in whatever you are planning." Owen held her eyes. "I will make sure Harris knows," he said. "They will be clear of it." "Thank you," Alina said. They sat in the corner of the hotel dining room while the other patrons finished their meals, and the last light went out of the window and Agnes moved around the room with a lamp. And they talked, quietly, carefully, like 2 people who are beginning to understand that they want to know each other but are not yet sure how to say it, about nothing important. About where Owen had grown up in Missouri and the way the winters there compared to New Mexico Territory winters. About the books Alina had brought west and then left behind or lost. About the kinds of things a person missed when they left a life behind. It was the longest conversation Alina had had in 2 years that was simply about being 2 people in a world. She walked back to the hotel from her kitchen duties at 10 and Owen walked her, because the night was dark and Pharaoh's scouts were potentially already in the area, which was a practical reason that was also not the only reason. They did not talk much on the walk. They did not need to. Something was present between them in the silence that was doing its own quiet work. At the hotel door, Eleanor stopped and turned to him. "You are a careful man," she said. "I try to be," Owen said. "I mean it as a compliment." She held his gaze. "It is rarer than you would think." Owen said nothing. But the thing that moved across his face was unmistakable even in the dark, some combination of feeling recognized and being slightly unsteady about it. Eleanor went inside. Thursday came cold and heavy with clouds that were promising snow. Owen had positioned his people. Ray on the west road, Chet on the south approach, Harris's 2 deputies at the north end of town near the stable where Pharaoh would most likely want to bring horses. Owen himself moved between the main street and the eastern side of town, staying visible without being conspicuous. At 2 in the afternoon, a rider came through the east road, and Owen recognized him from Eleanor's descriptions. A thin man with a dun coat who worked as an advance scout for Pharaoh, riding a town ahead of the main group to check for complications. Owen watched him from the corner of the dry goods store and let him pass, and then wired Harris with a single word: "Advancing." The rest of Thursday was quiet. At dusk, it began to snow. Pharaoh came into Harrow Creek at just before 9 on Friday morning, when the snow had settled to an inch on the ground, and the sky was the flat white of a weather system that intended to stay for a while. He came with 5 men, which was slightly fewer than the 7 Harris had expected, which meant either 2 had split off, or there was a second group coming from a different direction. Owen had Chet posted at the south, and sent word to Harris immediately when the group was spotted on the west road. He himself walked out onto the main street and stood in front of his office with his coat open and his hands loose at his sides. Marcus Pharaoh was 52, heavily built, with a gray streaked beard and the look of a man who had spent decades ensuring that other people were more afraid of him than he was of them. He pulled his horse up when he saw Owen in the street and looked at him with the flat assessment of someone who considered every unfamiliar face a variable to be managed. "Morning," Owen said. "Morning," Pharaoh said. He looked at the star. "Sheriff." "Calloway," Owen said. "Owen Calloway." "You are Marcus Pharaoh." A very slight change in Pharaoh's face. "You have me at a disadvantage. You have ridden past 3 of my deputies on the way into this town," Owen said in the same level voice. "And there is a U.S. Marshal behind that building to your left." He nodded once toward the dry goods store. "I think it is the other way around." What followed was not the kind of dramatic scene that stories sometimes made of these moments. Pharaoh looked at the building Owen had indicated and saw Harris step out. And he looked behind him and saw Ray at the road with a rifle. And he looked at his 5 men and made the kind of calculation that practical men make when the arithmetic has turned against them. There was a moment when it could have gone a different way. 2 of Pharaoh's men had their hands moving toward their weapons, and Owen saw it and kept his voice very steady and said, "I would not." And something in the steadiness of it communicated that the costs of trying were larger than the benefits. Pharaoh was taken into custody without a shot fired. His 5 men were disarmed and held. The 2 who had split off were picked up on the eastern road by Harris's deputies an hour later. By noon, the whole group was in custody, and Harris was on his wire to Albuquerque with the longest single transmission the Harrow Creek telegraph operator had ever processed. Owen walked back to the hotel at noon and found Eleanor in the kitchen and said, "It is done." Eleanor had been standing at the stove. She turned around. She looked at him for a long moment, and then something in her face that had been tightly held for a very long time simply released. She did not cry. She was not the kind of woman who cried easily in front of other people. But her eyes went bright and her chin trembled once, and she turned back to the stove and stood very still for a long moment. "Are you all right?" Owen asked. He had moved closer without quite deciding to. "Yes," she said. Her voice was not quite steady. "Give me a moment." He gave her the moment. He stood close enough that she could feel he was there and far enough that it was her moment to have. Then she turned around and looked at him, and there was something open in her face that had not been there before, something that had come through the release of a held breath that had been held for 2 years. "Thank you," she said. "You did more than I did," Owen said. "None of it happens without what you told me." Alina looked at him. Something was working its way through the careful arrangements she had built around herself. She could feel it moving like water finding the paths through stone. "There is going to be a trial," she said. "Yes." "I will need to be in Santa Fe." "Yes, Harris will arrange it." A pause. "And after that," she said, not quite a question. Owen held her eyes, and the kitchen was warm and smelled of the stew she had been making, and the snow outside came down past the window in soft, steady curtains. "After that," he said carefully, "I would like to know what you want." Alina looked at him for a long time. "I do not know yet," she said honestly. "That is all right," Owen said. "You do not have to know yet." The weeks between Pharaoh's arrest and the trial in Santa Fe were a kind of suspended time for both of them. A period of existing in the same town and the same daily rhythms, while something between them grew at its own pace without being pushed. Owen stopped eating at the corner table and started eating at the kitchen table of the hotel, which Agnes permitted with the brisk accommodation of a woman who had seen this particular development before and thought well of it. Alina cooked, and they ate together after the dining room had cleared, and they talked for longer and longer into the evenings. He told her about his father, who had been a carpenter in Missouri, and a man of such particular moral exactness that every object he had ever made had carried the quality of a statement. Owen had inherited the exactness, he said, though not the carpentry. He had gone into law after his father died, because it was the closest thing he could find to the thing his father had been doing, which was measuring the world against a standard and doing his best to help it live up. Alina told him about Cincinnati and her sister Clara and her mother's garden and the years before Thomas, when she had been a schoolteacher's assistant, and had loved the work with the particular love of someone who finds in teaching a way of being useful that feels entirely natural. She told him about the books she had read, and the ones she intended to read, and the way she had kept a journal in secret at the homestead until Thomas had found it, and about the blank pages she carried in her head now, things she had not been able to write down but had saved anyway. They talked about the injustice of it, the law's imperfect mechanisms, the way women in Alina's position were often left without recourse when the law itself had been compromised, or when the men who were supposed to enforce it had decided that a woman's testimony was worth less than a man's word. Owen did not flinch from this. He spoke about it plainly, with the self-awareness of someone who had spent enough time in courtrooms and offices to know what the system's failures were from the inside. He told her about a woman in his previous county who had come to him with a situation similar to Alina's, and about the fact that he had not been able to help her as much as she needed, and about how that had stayed with him. Alina listened to him with the particular quality of attention she gave to things that mattered to her, and she noticed that talking with Owen Calloway was a thing that expanded her rather than contracted her, and she held that observation with the careful hands of someone who was not yet ready to call it by its real name. On a Sunday morning in late January, Alina went to First Grace Church. She sat in the back left bench, the same bench she had slept on 6 weeks earlier, and she listened to the minister, and she looked at the candlelight on the altar, and she thought about the shape of her life, and about where it might be going. The church was warm this time. Someone had fixed the window. After the service, Owen found her on the church steps. "I did not know you came to services," he said. "I did not know I did either," Alina said. "I wanted to come back." She looked at the door. "I needed to see it differently." Owen stood beside her in the pale January sunlight. "Does it look different?" he asked. "Yes," she said. She looked at him. "Very." There was a quality to that moment, the two of them on the church steps in the thin winter sun, that was both simple and enormous, like the moment before you say a thing that changes the shape of things. "Alina," Owen said. "I know," she said. "I have not said anything yet." "I know what you were going to say." He looked at her and she looked at him, and the simple honesty of the moment was almost funny, the way the most direct of human things sometimes found a way around all the language built to contain them. "Well," Owen said. "Well," Alina agreed. He reached out, and she let him take her hand, and they stood on the church steps in the pale January light of 1884 in a small town in the New Mexico Territory. And the thing between them that had been growing in careful silence was suddenly and entirely obvious to both of them. The trial was in March. Alina traveled to Santa Fe with Marshal Harris and his deputies, and Owen rode with them, having arranged for Ray Sutton to hold things in Harrow Creek for the 10 days they expected to be away. Santa Fe in March was cold and busy and smelled of pinon smoke, and the complicated urgency of a territorial capital managing its growth. The boarding house Harris used was on a quiet street and run by a woman named Mrs. Cordero, who fed her residents 3 substantial meals a day and asked no questions. Alina had a clean room with a window that looked over a small courtyard where a fig tree grew in a large pot, bare-branched still, but with the earliest thickening of buds at its tips. Owen had a room 2 doors down. The trial lasted 4 days. Alina testified on the 2nd day. She walked into that courtroom in a blue dress she had bought from a dressmaker in Harrow Creek 2 weeks earlier with the money she had saved. And she sat in the witness chair and answered every question put to her with the clear, precise, unflinching steadiness of a woman who had been through too much to be frightened by a courtroom. Thomas was there. He was sitting with his attorney at the defendant's table, thinner than she remembered and older somehow, and when she walked in he looked at her with an expression that moved through several things quickly: shock and anger, and something that might, in a man with more honest access to himself, have been shame. Alina looked at him once and then looked at the prosecutor and answered the questions. She did not look at Thomas again. Owen sat in the gallery throughout her testimony. She could not see him from the witness chair, but she knew he was there, and knowing it was enough. The jury needed 3 hours. Marcus Farrow was convicted on 7 counts including land fraud, intimidation, and 2 counts of assault that had been attached from the testimony of others. 3 of his associates received lesser sentences. 2 received probation on account of cooperation. Thomas Parrish pleaded guilty to a reduced charge of conspiracy and received 2 years, which Harris acknowledged was lighter than strict justice required, but heavier than Thomas's attorney had hoped for. Alina stood on the courthouse steps in the cold March air and held all of this inside her for a moment. The sound of the city, the smell of the smoke, the thin, bright light of a New Mexico March. Owen came and stood beside her. "How are you?" he asked. "Strange," she said. "Free, I think." "It does not feel like what I expected." "What did you expect?" "I am not sure. Something bigger maybe, or louder." She shook her head. "It just feels quiet. Quiet is good, Owen said. She looked at him sideways. You would think so. I would, he agreed. And then he said, Eleanor. And something in the way he said her name was different from every other time he had said it. Different from the careful, neutral way he had said it that first night in the church. And different from the thoughtful way he had said it in her kitchen. And different even from the way he had said it on the church steps. This time it carried the full weight of what he meant, which was not a single word but an entire sentence that he was putting into her name and trusting her to read. Eleanor turned to face him. I know, she said, softly. I know. Owen reached up and touched her face with one hand, just his fingers against her cheek. And it was the most careful, deliberate touch. The gesture of a man who understood that touch was a language, and this particular sentence needed to be spoken precisely. Eleanor put her hand over his and held it there. The courtyard of Mrs. Cordero's boarding house was private and small, and the fig tree stood in its pot with its early buds on the bare branches. And the evening was cold and blue, and Owen kissed Eleanor Parrish for the first time under that fig tree, while the sounds of the city moved around the walls, and the thin, cold air of March pressed in from all sides. It was not a complicated kiss. It was the kind of kiss that knows exactly what it is. Eleanor pressed her forehead against his jaw afterward, and they stood that way for a moment, his arms around her, her hands at the front of his coat. I am not entirely sure what I am now, she said quietly. I am not Thomas's wife anymore, not really, not in any way that counts. I am not the woman from Cincinnati. I am not the woman from the homestead. She pulled back and looked at him. I am still finding out. I know, Owen said. I am not asking you to be anything you are not. What are you asking? She said. He looked at her with the particular directness she had come to understand was simply how he was, not aggressiveness but a fundamental honesty about what he saw and what he thought. I am asking if you want to come home, he said. And I am asking if you might someday consider making it home in more than just the immediate sense. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. Yes, she said, to both. They returned to Harrow Creek on a Tuesday in mid-March with the weather turning towards spring's early gestures, the cold loosening slightly, the sky a clearer shade of blue. The drive back took 2 days, and they rode side by side most of it, talking and sometimes not talking, comfortable in both with the ease of people who have moved past the need to perform for each other. Back in Harrow Creek, things found their new shape gradually and honestly. Eleanor continued her work at the hotel and began, with Agnes's support and a small loan from the bank that she negotiated herself, to put together the beginning of a plan to open a small bakery in the space next to the hotel that had been empty since the previous winter. Owen continued his work as sheriff with the same steady attention he had always brought to it, though the deputies both noticed that he smiled more easily than before, and that the circles under his eyes had lightened. Owen was formally divorced from the situation of Thomas Parrish by an attorney in Santa Fe who handled these things for women in Eleanor's position, and Eleanor's legal status was settled by mid-April. She kept the name Parrish because it was her name as much as it had ever been his, and she had reclaimed it along with everything else. On an evening in May, Owen asked Eleanor to sit on the steps of the office with him and watch the sunset, which was the kind of sunset that the New Mexico Territory produced with a particular generosity. All the reds and oranges and the deep, impossible purple of the far mesa. They sat on the steps with their shoulders touching. I have a question, Owen said. Eleanor looked at the sunset. Ask it. Will you marry me? Eleanor was quiet for a moment, not because she did not know the answer, but because she wanted to give the answer the space it deserved. Yes, she said. She turned and looked at him and found him looking at her with something on his face that was purely and entirely undisguised, No lawman's control, no careful management, just the open face of a man who loves and is not ashamed of it. Yes, Owen. Absolutely yes. He took her hand and held it, and they watched the sun go down together. They were married in First Grace Church on the 1st of June, 1884, in a ceremony that was attended by Agnes Holt and Chet Dobbs and Ray Sutton and the Good family, who had traveled from their farm for the occasion, and who Alina embraced for a very long time when they arrived. Marshall Harris sent a letter that Agnes read aloud, which was practical and warm in equal measure, and caused Chet to laugh out loud at one point. The minister, who had not known Alina during the dark week in December, now pronounced her and Owen married in the same building where Owen had found her sleeping on the cold bench, and Alina held Owen's hands at the altar and thought about the strange and particular mercy of how things sometimes turned. And Owen held Alina's hands and thought about a woman in the cold and two hands raised in the dark, and what those two things had grown into. They had a wedding supper at the hotel, and Agnes made a roast, and Alina made both the bread and the cake, and the dining room was warm and full. And there was dancing after in the street, because it was June and the night was perfect for it. Alina danced with Owen in the street of Harrow Creek while the fiddle player from the saloon played something slow and sweet, and the stars came out above the desert in their thousands. "I have something to tell you," Owen said quietly, near the end of the dancing. "Tell me," Alina said. "I folded the quilt," he said. "The one my mother made. I think it is time it was used properly." Alina leaned her head against his shoulder and smiled. The summer of 1884 was a full one. Alina's bakery opened in the space next to the hotel in July, and became immediately and sustainably popular, because Alina had a gift for bread and pastry that Agnes had recognized on the very first day, and because the people of Harrow Creek had a considerable appetite for the kind of honest, excellent food that Alina Parish produced with something that was less like labor and more like satisfaction. She hired a young woman named Della to help with the morning rush, and Della was cheerful and quick and brought her own considerable skills to the operation. Owen, meanwhile, had successfully navigated the aftermath of the Farrow case, which had produced its own administrative complexity. The county commissioner had written a formal commendation, and there was talk of a promotion to a larger jurisdiction, which Owen had declined because Harrow Creek needed a sheriff, and he had given his word to Harrow Creek, and he was a man who kept his word. Chet Dobbs, emboldened by having participated in one of the county's most significant law enforcement operations in recent memory, had begun courting the daughter of the dry goods store owner, which occupied him considerably, and improved his personality in ways that Ray Sutton appreciated with the dry equanimity of a man who had seen it before. In September, Alina told Owen she was expecting. Owen put down his coffee cup very carefully and looked at her across the breakfast table of the house they had moved into in August, a proper house on the east end of town with 3 rooms and a porch and a kitchen garden that Alina had immediately assessed and begun planning for. "Are you sure?" he asked. "Yes," she said. He came around the table and pulled her close and held her, and Alina felt him breathe, one deep, careful breath against her hair, and then he said, "Good," in a voice that was not quite the usual voice, slightly lower and more unsteady in a way that she recognized as the particular unsteadiness of Owen Calloway when he felt something too large to fully contain. "Good," he said again, more firmly. Alina laughed. "You said that already. I know." He held her tighter. "I would like to say it a few more times." The winter of 1884 came in cold and bright. The sky that particular blue that winter produced in the territory, and Alina baked and built her business and grew round and capable, and Owen looked at her with a steady, uncomplicated love that she had come to understand, was one of his defining characteristics, the ability to love without qualification or performance, quietly and entirely. They talked in the evenings by the fire. They read together. Owen had been a reader all his life, and Alina was deeply pleased to have access to his shelves, which included 3 years of accumulated Western newspapers, 2 volumes of territorial law, a Bible, and a surprising number of novels. They argued about the novels in the comfortable, productive way of 2 people with genuine opinions, and they always ended the argument by reading the disputed passages aloud to each other, which invariably settled the question or made it more interesting. On a morning in late February of 1885, their son was born. He was born in the house on the east end of town, with the doctor in attendance and Agnes Holt and Della waiting in the front room, and Owen in the room with Alina the entire time, because she had asked him to stay, and he had not hesitated for a moment. It was a good birth. Hard and long, but good. And when it was over and Alina was holding their son, red-faced and newborn and already making his preferences known at considerable volume, Owen sat on the edge of the bed beside her and looked at this small person who had not existed before and now entirely did. "He looks furious," Owen said. "He does," Alina agreed, not displeased. "Strong lungs." "Very." She looked up at him. "What do you want to name him?" They had talked about names but not settled, and now that he was present and particular, there was the question of what name fit the actual person. "Daniel," Owen said. "For my father." Alina looked at their son. "Daniel Calloway," she said, testing it. Daniel expressed no immediate opinion, being occupied with other priorities. "Daniel," Alina confirmed. Owen put his arm around Alina's shoulders, and they sat together in the morning light with Daniel between them and the world outside going on at its usual pace, entirely unaware of what had been added to it. The spring of 1885 was one of the better springs the territory had seen in some years. The rains came in their proper time, and the grass came up green on the mesa, and the garden Alina had been planning through the winter went in with an energy and optimism that Daniel, growing rapidly and vocal as ever in his crib near the kitchen window, seemed to appreciate. Alina brought Daniel to the bakery in the mornings, where Della immediately became devoted to him, and where the regulars of Harrow Creek made his acquaintance with the genuine warmth of a community that had watched his parents' story unfold, and had found it, on the whole, a good story. Agnes Holt held Daniel for the first time on his 3rd week of life and declared him sensible, which was Agnes's highest compliment. Owen carried Daniel in the evenings sometimes, walking the main street during his rounds with his son tucked against his shoulder, which caused both of his deputies no small amount of pleasure to witness. Chet, now engaged to Pettigrew's daughter, had begun developing opinions about child rearing based on watching Owen that Ray considered ambitious, given that Chet's own experience was still theoretical. There were hard days too, as there always are. Alina had days when the weight of the previous years came back to her in particular, and she sat with it, and sometimes talked to Owen about it, and sometimes sat with it alone, depending on what the day required. Owen had days when the job was a heavy thing, and when the distance between what the law was supposed to do and what it sometimes managed to do felt uncomfortably wide. They had days when they were short with each other, and days when communication broke down in the ordinary small ways that require ordinary small repairs. But they were honest with each other in those times, with the honesty of people who had both learned the cost of concealment, and the repairs were made, and the texture of the life they were building together was stronger for the repairs than it would have been without them. In the summer of 1886, Alina was expecting again. This time she told Owen in the garden, where she had him helping her stake the tomato plants, and he dropped the stake he was holding and turned to look at her, and she said, "Do not say good twice." Owen laughed, a genuine laugh, one of the ones that transformed his face entirely. "Good," he said. "Owen, I know, I said it once, that is an improvement." Alina picked up the dropped stake and handed it back to him. "It is," she allowed. They finished staking the tomatoes. Their daughter was born in January of 1887, on a night of light snow that put a thin, white cover on the street outside and made the house feel warm by contrast. She arrived more quickly and peacefully than Daniel had. And Daniel, now 2 years old and very much himself, was permitted to come in and view his sister from a safe and supervised distance. He looked at her for a long moment with the serious, concentrated expression that he had inherited from Owen, and that Alina found deeply funny in a 2-year-old. "Small," Daniel said. "She will get bigger," Owen told him. "Like me. Very much like you." Daniel appeared to find this satisfactory. He went back to the front room where Agnes was waiting, apparently feeling that the situation was under control. "What do we name her?" Owen asked. Alina had known the answer to this one since before she knew the baby was a girl. "Clara," she said. "For my sister." Owen nodded. He traced a gentle finger along their daughter's cheek. "Hello, Clara," he said quietly. Clara Calloway regarded the world from her first moments in it, with a calm, comprehensive gaze that the doctor said he had never quite seen in a newborn, and that Alina recognized with a certain rueful humor as entirely familiar. She wrote to her sister that week, the first letter in 3 years, long and honest and full. Her sister wrote back within a month, and the correspondence that resumed between them became one of the more sustaining regular events in Alina's year, a thread reconnected. The years after Clara's birth were years of building, of the particular sustained and satisfying labor of people who are making something that matters. The bakery expanded and took the whole of the space next to the hotel and employed 3 women by 1889. Owen was offered the position of territorial marshal twice, and declined both times because Harrow Creek was his town and he had said so and he meant it, and because the life he was living in it was the life he wanted, and he was not ashamed of wanting it. Daniel started school in 1889 and was immediately controversial in the classroom in the productive way of a child who asks too many questions for comfort and does not stop asking until the questions are answered. His teacher, a young woman named Miss Avery who had come from Kansas, wrote in her first report that Daniel Calloway was either going to be a great blessing or a great challenge to whatever profession he eventually chose, possibly both. Clara, when she reached the age of 3, turned out to have her father's silence and her mother's determination in a combination that Owen described as extremely effective, and Alina described as extremely familiar. She liked the garden with a thoroughness that reminded Alina of her mother, and she could name every plant in it by her 4th birthday. On a summer evening in 1890, 6 years after Owen had pushed open the door of First Grace Church and found Alina sleeping in the cold, they sat together on the porch of the house on the east end of town. Daniel was inside, supposedly reading but probably also doing something else that would require intervention shortly. Clara was asleep. The evening was warm and the stars were coming out over the mesa in their usual thousands. Alina had her feet tucked under her in the porch chair and a cup of tea going cold in her hand, and she was reading a letter from Clara the sister, which apparently had news in it because she kept stopping to make sounds of pleased surprise. Owen sat beside her with his coat off and his hands loose in his lap, watching the stars come up. "Clara is coming to visit," Alina said. "In October." "Good," Owen said, Elena lowered the letter. My sister is coming to visit for the first time in 8 years, and that is all you have to say. Good, Owen said again. Then, because he could see from her expression that more was required. I am genuinely glad. I have been looking forward to meeting her. I said so last month. You did, Elena allowed, and I meant it both times. Elena turned back to the letter and then put it down and looked at the evening for a while. The porch had a view east toward the mesa, and on evenings like this one it was a view that did not require any commentary. Owen, she said, do you remember what you said to me that first night? He knew immediately what she meant. He always knew what she meant. I said come home, he said. I said there is a warm room ready. Elena nodded slowly. I did not believe you, she said. I thought there would be a catch. I thought there was something you wanted or something you were trying to do. I know. There was not. No, Owen agreed. There was not. Elena looked at him. The stars were fully out now, and the light on his face was the same light that had been on it that first night, the low gold of lamplight and the silver from outside, the same quiet face and the same direct eyes. I was right to come, she said. Owen looked at her. Yes, he said. I think so. I know so, Elena said. She reached over and put her hand on his. He turned his hand over and held hers, which was what he always did, a gesture so established and natural now that it had become one of the fundamental textures of daily life, like the smell of the bakery or the weight of Daniel's questions or the particular way Clara laughed, which came rarely and was always worth waiting for. They sat on the porch of their house in Harrow Creek in the summer of 1890 and held hands in the way of people who have built something honest and lasting together, and who know it and are grateful for it with the daily, practical, unshowy gratitude that is the most durable form of the feeling. Inside the house, Daniel put down whatever he was not supposed to be doing and came to the doorway and looked at his parents on the porch. Can I come out? He called. Yes, Owen said. Daniel came out and squeezed between the two chairs and sat on the porch step and looked at the stars with the concentrated attention of a 5-year-old who is fully convinced that there are things out there worth knowing about. How many are there? Daniel asked. Many thousands, Owen said. More than I can count. More than anyone can count. Daniel sat with this information. I will try anyway, he said. Elena looked at Owen over Daniel's head, and something moved between them that was composed of amusement and tenderness, and the complicated specific pride of parents watching a person become themselves. Owen squeezed Elena's hand. She squeezed back. The night was warm and full, and the stars were out in their thousands over the mesa, and Harrow Creek was quiet in the way of a small town at peace with itself, the sounds of it soft and steady as a heartbeat. Somewhere down the main street, a door opened and closed. The stable made its low sounds. The church stood at the end of the block with its small steeple against the sky. The same church where a quiet sheriff had found a woman sleeping in the cold and had stood very still, and then made a simple offer that had turned out to be the beginning of everything. After Clara the sister left, Elena stood in the kitchen for a long time just standing, and Owen came in and asked if she was all right, and she said yes and turned around, and the look on her face was everything he needed to know. Good, he said. Elena laughed. You always say that. I always mean it, he said. Good, he did not say it this time. He did not need to. Elena already knew.